Sarah Matthews pushed open the door of the small cafe in Portland, Oregon, feeling the weight of yet another day where she needed to prove she existed. At 37, with her blonde hair tied in a simple ponytail and visible scars on her forearms, she carried a story that few believed when she told it. She had left the fire department 3 years earlier, not for lack of vocation, but because the emotional toll of being constantly questioned had become unbearable. Now she worked as a safety instructor at a private company, a job that paid the bills, but left a void in her heart, where once burned the passion for saving lives. That Thursday afternoon, she was in the cafe waiting for an interview for a better position, perhaps as a training supervisor at a larger corporation. The woman who was supposed to interview her was running late, so Sarah ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the light rain falling on the streets of Portland. She didn't immediately notice when 2 women at the next table started talking about firefighters, but her ears perked up when she heard one of them mention the Seattle residential tower fire 5 years ago. One of the women, blonde and well-dressed, spoke authoritatively about how her cousin was a real firefighter, not like those women who joined the Corps just to fill diversity quotas. She laughed as she told a story about a supposed female firefighter who had frozen during a rescue and needed to be saved by her male colleagues. Sarah felt her blood boil, but kept her eyes fixed on the window, trying to control herself. It was comments like these that had haunted her throughout her career, insinuations that she didn't deserve to be there, that she was weak, that she was a risk to the team. The other woman agreed, saying she had read online about how physical standards had been lowered to allow women to pass the tests. Sarah clenched her fists under the table, remembering the countless hours at the gym, the tests she had taken under the same rigorous criteria as any man, the 300 kilos she had to carry upstairs with full equipment. She had passed everything on the first try, surpassing several male candidates, but it never seemed to matter when people had already decided she couldn't possibly be capable. The first woman continued, now talking about fake medals and how she had seen a news report about people pretending to be war veterans or emergency heroes to gain attention. She mentioned that probably half the people who wore uniforms at public events were imposters. Sarah bit her lip hard, feeling tears threatening to well up, not from sadness, but from a deep, long-standing anger. She rarely wore her Medal of Valor, keeping it in a box at home, because every time she wore it, someone questioned her, someone doubted her, someone demanded proof, as if she were a criminal. It was then that the cafe door opened, and a tall man with gray hair and a military bearing entered, shaking the rain off his coat. Sarah recognized him immediately, even though they had only met once, years ago. It was James Mitchell, the Seattle Fire Commissioner, a man who had dedicated 40 years of his life to the service. He had a commanding presence, and even in the casual atmosphere of the cafe, people turned to look. He ordered a coffee at the counter, and while he waited, his eyes swept around the room, landing briefly on Sarah before moving on. Sarah quickly looked away, not wanting to be recognized, not wanting to relive that day. But it was too late. Mitchell frowned, studying her face for a moment, and then his eyes widened in recognition. He picked up his coffee and, to Sarah's discomfort, walked straight to her table. She considered getting up and leaving, but something held her back. Perhaps pride, perhaps weariness of running away. The commissioner stopped beside her desk, holding his coffee cup in both hands, his voice low but clear as he spoke. He said her name, Sarah Matthews, and asked if he could sit down. She nodded stiffly, feeling the eyes of the 2 women at the next table now fixed on them. Mitchell pulled up a chair and sat down, his eyes still studying her face as if checking an old memory. He began to speak, saying he had never forgotten that day in Seattle. The fire had started on the 12th floor of a 20-story residential tower, fueled by a gas leak that turned 3 apartments into an instant inferno. Sarah and her team were the first to arrive, finding people screaming from the windows, black smoke pouring into the gray afternoon sky. The protocol was to wait for reinforcements, assess the structure, establish a safety perimeter. But there were children trapped on the 13th floor, their voices echoing through the smoke, and time was running out quickly. Sarah had made the decision in seconds, disobeying her captain's direct order to wait. She entered the building with only one colleague willing to follow her, climbing the stairs as the fire consumed the upper floors. The heat was unbearable. Visibility was almost zero, and each breath through the mask seemed insufficient. They found the children, 3 siblings aged between 5 and 10, clinging to each other in a smoke-filled room. the door blocked by debris from the hallway. Mitchell told this story aloud in the cafe, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, and Sarah noticed that the two women at the next table had completely stopped talking and were listening to every word. The commissioner described how Sarah had used an axe to cut her way through the wreckage, how she had carried the youngest child while her partner carried the other two, how they had descended 13 flights of stairs with the fire chasing them, the ceiling beginning to collapse behind them. He spoke of how Sarah had tripped on the 7th floor, falling and severely twisting her ankle, but refusing to leave the child or call for help. She had continued down, limping, with tears, mingled with sweat beneath her mask, until they finally emerged on the ground floor just seconds before an explosion rocked the building. All 3 children survived without serious injuries. Sarah spent 2 weeks in the hospital with 2nd-degree burns and a fractured ankle, but refused to be called a heroine. Mitchell paused, taking a sip of coffee, and then looked directly at the 2 women at the next table, who now seemed to want to sink into their chairs. He said, loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear, that Sarah Matthews had received the City of Seattle Medal of Valor, the highest honor bestowed upon a firefighter, and that she was one of the bravest and most competent professionals he had known in 4 decades of service. One of the women, the blonde who had spoken so confidently about fake firefighters, was now visibly pale. She murmured something to her friend, and they both began to gather their things quickly. But Mitchell wasn't finished. He continued, explaining that Sarah had retired early, not because she couldn't do the job, but because the psychological trauma of being constantly questioned, doubted, and disrespected by people who had never risked their lives for anyone had become unbearable. He mentioned the times Sarah had been subjected to internal investigations based on anonymous accusations that she had falsified qualifications, the times her male colleagues had to defend her abilities, the extra psychological evaluations she had to undergo, while men with similar or worse problems were left alone. Mitchell spoke about the system that failed people like Sarah, that punished excellence when it came from someone who didn't fit the expected mold. Sarah felt tears finally welling up in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She had held back these emotions for so long, had built such high walls around her pain, that hearing someone, especially someone with Mitchell's authority and respect, validate her experience, broke something inside her. It wasn't weakness she felt, but a deep and exhausting relief, as if a weight she had carried for years could finally be put down. The 2 women at the next table got up to leave, but the blonde stopped, turning to Sarah. She began to speak, her voice trembling, trying to apologize, saying she didn't know, that she was just repeating what she had heard, that she didn't mean anything personal. Sarah looked her directly in the eyes, her voice calm but firm as she replied. She said that was exactly the problem, that people repeated stories without thinking, judged without knowing, destroyed reputations and lives with casual gossip in cafes, never considering that there were real people behind those stories. The woman shook her head, tears now also in her eyes, and mumbled another apology before quickly leaving with her friend. The cafe had fallen completely silent, everyone present having witnessed the confrontation. Mitchell was still seated, watching Sarah with an expression that mixed pride and sadness. He said he had looked for her after she left the fire station, that he wanted to offer help, or at least a conversation, but she had disappeared, moving to another city and avoiding any connection with her past. Sarah wiped away her tears with the back of her hand and explained that she needed to completely distance herself in order to begin healing. Every memory, every uniform, every siren in the street was a trigger that took her back to those days of self-doubt, of wondering if maybe everyone was right, if she really shouldn't be there. Therapy had helped, time had helped, but the wound was still there, just covered by layers of distance and denial. Mitchell nodded slowly, understanding. He mentioned that he was in Portland for a conference on mental health and emergency services, a topic that was finally receiving the attention it deserved. He spoke about the alarming suicide rates among firefighters, especially among those who face discrimination or repeated trauma, and how the system was beginning to recognize that physical strength wasn't enough if mental strength was constantly being eroded. He then asked Sarah if she had ever considered using her experience to help others who were going through what she had gone through. He explained that many fire academies were starting mentorship programs, especially focused on supporting minorities and women in the field, and that someone like her, with real-world experience and a powerful story, could make a genuine difference. Sarah hesitated, admitting she had thought about it but feared no one would listen, that her own story of quitting would be used against her as proof of weakness. Mitchell shook his head firmly, saying it was exactly the opposite. Recognizing when a system is toxic and having the courage to leave is not weakness, it's self-preservation and wisdom. Coming back later, stronger and with perspective, to help change that system, that's true courage. He pulled a card from his pocket and pushed it across the table toward Sarah. It was his business card, with a handwritten cell phone number on the back. Mitchell said that if she ever wanted to talk about possibilities, about how she could use her voice and experience, he would be available. He also mentioned that he knew the organizers of the conference that was taking place at the nearby hotel, and that it would be powerful if she considered sharing her story there, not as a victim, but as someone who had survived and had insights on how to improve. Sarah took the card, holding it between her fingers as if it were something precious and fragile. She said she needed to think, that she wasn't sure if she was ready to expose herself like that again. Mitchell understood, saying there was no rush, that the offer would remain open. He then stood up, preparing to leave, but stopped and turned to her once more, his expression serious. The commissioner said something Sarah would never forget. He said she had saved 3 lives that day in Seattle, but that by honestly sharing her story, by showing both the heroism and the pain, she could save dozens or hundreds of other lives. Lives of people who were silently battling the same demons, who needed to know they weren't alone, that they weren't weak, that the system was wrong, not them. After Mitchell left, Sarah was left alone at the table, the card still in her hand, the coffee now cold. She realized that the woman who was supposed to interview her had called to cancel due to an emergency, but somehow that didn't matter anymore. Something had changed in that conversation. A door she had kept firmly closed had opened slightly, letting in a light she wasn't sure she was ready to face, but which she also could no longer ignore. In the following days, Sarah found herself constantly thinking about Mitchell's words. She began researching the mentorship programs he had mentioned, reading articles about changes in fire academies, about efforts to create more inclusive and supportive environments. The more she read, the more she realized that her story was not unique, that there were hundreds of women and others who faced similar barriers, who gave up silently or fought alone. A week later, Sarah picked up the phone and called the number on Mitchell's card. They talked for over an hour, and by the end of the call, she had agreed to participate in a panel at the next regional conference, not just as a speaker, but as a consultant too. Develop new psychological support protocols. It was daunting. It was exposing herself in a way she had avoided for years, but it was also liberating in a way she hadn't anticipated. Sarah also began reconnecting with former colleagues from the Seattle Fire Department, people she had tried to stay in touch with but whom she had pushed away in her need to escape it all. She discovered that many of these people had realized what was happening and felt guilty for not having done more to protect her. These conversations were difficult, but necessary, opening space for forgiveness and mutual understanding. 2 months after the meeting at the cafe, Sarah stood on a stage before 200 firefighters, administrators, and public policy officials, telling her full story for the first time. She spoke about the fire, about the metal, but more importantly, about what came after. She described the slow erosion of her confidence under the constant weight of self-doubt, the sleepless nights, questioning herself, the painful decision to leave a career she loved, because staying was literally killing her inside. When it was over, the room was in absolute silence. Then, slowly, one person began to applaud, then another, and soon the whole room was on its feet, the ovation lasting several minutes. But what impacted Sarah most were the people who came to talk to her afterward, especially the young women and others who were considering or already working in emergency services. They thanked her for her honesty, for naming something that many felt but didn't have words to express. A young female firefighter, no older than 25, hugged Sarah with tears in her eyes, saying she was about to give up, that she thought it was just her, that something was wrong with her. Hearing that someone as decorated and capable as Sarah had struggled with the same feelings and had survived, had decided to come back and fight to change things, gave this young woman the strength to continue and seek the support she needed. Sarah realized at that moment that Mitchell was right. She had saved 3 lives that day in Seattle, but she was saving lives again now, in a different but equally important way. And this time, she was also saving herself, reclaiming a part of her identity that had been stolen, reclaiming the right to be both strong and vulnerable, both heroic and human. In the months that followed, Sarah built a new career as a consultant and speaker, working with fire departments across the country to develop more effective support programs. She also returned to therapy, but this time not to escape her past, but to integrate it in a healthy way into who she was becoming. The process wasn't linear. There were difficult days when old wounds ached, but there was also a growing sense of purpose and peace. She maintained regular contact with Mitchell, who became not only a mentor, but a genuine friend. He shared his own struggles, his own moments of self-doubt and a long career, and this mutual vulnerability created a connection that transcended hierarchy or generational differences. They were simply two people who had dedicated their lives to something greater than themselves, trying to leave things a little better than they found them. Sarah never forgot those two women in the cafe, their cruel words spoken without thinking. But with time, she was able to see that moment, not as something that diminished her, but as a catalyst that eventually led her back to a path of meaning and impact. She even wondered sometimes if they knew what their words had triggered, if they had any idea that that casual conversation had changed not just one life, but potentially dozens through the work Sarah now did. A year after their meeting at the cafe, Sarah was back in Portland for a conference. She walked into the same cafe, ordered the same black coffee, and sat at the same table by the window. But this time, she wasn't hiding who she was, or ashamed of her past. She wore a discreet necklace with a miniature replica of her medal, not as a cry for validation, but as a silent reminder to herself of all she had survived and accomplished. And when she saw a young firefighter being aggressively questioned by a customer in a cafe about whether he was really qualified because he looked too young and small for the job, Sarah didn't hesitate. She stood up, walked over to their table, and quietly but firmly intervened, offering the young man the kind of support and validation she had so often wished she had received, because now she understood that this was her true calling, not just fighting fires, but fighting the ignorance and prejudice that burned through people's lives in equally destructive ways. And in that fight, she had finally found not just redemption, but renewal. The young firefighter Sarah had defended looked at her with an expression that mixed relief and surprise. He was at most 22 years old, with short, dark hair and a build that, while athletic, was smaller than the stereotype many imagined for the profession. The client who had questioned him, a middle-aged man with an arrogant demeanor, seemed momentarily disconcerted by Sarah's intervention, but quickly recovered his defensive attitude. The man began by saying that he had every right to question the capabilities of those who were supposedly protecting his community, that his taxes paid those salaries, and that he was simply expressing legitimate concerns. Sarah kept her voice calm but firm as she replied that legitimate concerns were welcome, but public humiliation based on physical appearance was not concern. It was merely cruelty, disguised as pragmatism. She explained that she was personally familiar with the rigor of the physical and psychological tests that firefighters had to pass, that the standards hadn't been lowered, but rather refined over the years to assess real capabilities rather than arbitrary brute force. Sarah mentioned that some of the most efficient firefighters she had known were smaller people, whose agility and ability to navigate tight spaces had saved lives where sheer strength would have made no difference whatsoever. The young firefighter, whose name tag on his casual uniform read Derek Ortiz, seemed to be trying not to let his emotions show, but Sarah recognized that expression because she had worn it countless times. It was the mask of someone accustomed to defending their existence in a space where they constantly had to prove they deserved to be there. It was exhausting, she knew, having to justify your qualifications every time someone decided you didn't fit their mental image of a hero. The customer muttered something about modern times and political correctness, before grabbing his bag and leaving the cafe with heavy steps. As the door closed behind him, Derek exhaled deeply, as if he had been holding his breath throughout the entire confrontation. He thanked Sarah in a slightly trembling voice, admitting that this kind of situation happened at least once a week, and that it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep the words from getting out. Sarah asked to sit with him, if he didn't mind, and Derek immediately agreed. For the next 40 minutes, they talked about his experiences as a shorter Latino man in a predominantly white fire department in suburban Portland. Derek recounted how he passed tests with flying colors, how his agility and quick thinking made him exceptionally good at confined space rescues, but how none of that seemed to matter to people who had already decided he didn't fit the mold. He mentioned that his family was proud of him, especially his father, who had worked his whole life in construction and had always dreamed of a better future for his children. But Derek also admitted that he was beginning to question whether it was worth continuing to fight against this constant tide of doubt and disrespect. He had started having panic attacks before his shifts, waking up in the middle of the night, mentally reviewing every call, every decision, worried that a single mistake would be used as evidence that all the suspicions about him were correct. Sarah listened to all of this with painful familiarity, recognizing patterns she herself had lived through. When Derek finished speaking, she shared parts of her own story, not the entire narrative she now told at conferences, but the most personal and vulnerable pieces. She spoke of nights crying in the shower after shifts where she had performed flawlessly, but still faced disdainful comments, of how she had internalized so much self-doubt that she began to question even her own memories of success. Derek listened with growing attention, and when Sarah casually mentioned her Medal of Valor, his eyes widened. He asked if she was the Sarah Matthews, the Seattle firefighter he'd read about in an article during his training, the one who had saved the 3 children in the apartment building. Sarah confirmed, with a small smile, touching the discreet necklace she wore, and saw Derek's expression change from surprise to something close to reverence. But Sarah quickly redirected the conversation, explaining that the medal hadn't protected her from doubt, hadn't made her immune to the psychological trauma of being constantly questioned. She talked about leaving the fire department, about the years of absence, and then about the chance encounter in that same cafe that had changed her life. Derek listened, with an intensity that showed how much those words meant to him, how much he needed to hear that he wasn't alone, that he wasn't weak. Sarah then asked Derek the same question Mitchell had asked her. What did he really want to do with his career? If he could imagine a future where the environment was different, where he was respected for what he was capable of doing instead of judged by his appearance, would he still want to be a firefighter? Derek didn't hesitate to answer yes, that despite everything, he couldn't imagine doing anything else, that saving lives was what gave meaning to his existence. Sarah nodded, recognizing that passion because she herself carried it. She then spoke about her current work as a consultant, about the mentoring programs she was helping to develop, and about how she was always looking for people with lived experiences who could contribute authentic perspectives. She asked if Derek would be interested in participating in some focus groups, in sharing his experiences in a way that could help shape better policies. Derek seemed surprised by the offer, asking why anyone would care what he had to say. Sarah smiled sadly and replied that this was exactly the mindset the system had instilled in him, the idea that his voice didn't matter, that he should be grateful just for being there and not making waves. But the truth was that voices like his were crucial because they were the people on the front lines, living the daily realities, who truly knew what needed to change. They exchanged contact information, and Sarah promised to send details about future opportunities for engagement. When they finally said goodbye, Derek seemed different, not magically transformed, but a little more upright, a little more hopeful. Sarah watched him leave the cafe and felt a deep satisfaction, a sense that each conversation like that, each small intervention, was a way of repairing not only the system, but also the wounds in her own heart. In the following months, Sarah stayed in touch with Derek, monitoring his progress and offering support when he faced difficult days. She also connected him with other firefighters who had participated in her mentoring programs, creating a support network that spanned several states. Derek eventually became an active voice in his department, advocating for change and helping to educate colleagues about the impact of their words and actions. Sarah continued her work as a consultant, but she also began writing. She had resisted the idea for a long time, feeling that there were already therapists and academics writing about trauma in the emergency department. But Mitchell convinced her that there was value in a personal and honest narrative, something that people in the profession could read and see themselves reflected in. So she began a book, not a dramatic autobiography, but a reflective exploration of identity, belonging, and resilience in high-pressure environments. The writing process was therapeutic in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Each chapter forced her to confront memories she had buried, to examine her own reactions and choices with brutal honesty. She wrote about moments of courage, but also about moments of paralyzing doubt, about days when she had considered simply not showing up for work, about the loneliness of carrying a weight that no one around her seemed able or willing to acknowledge. She also wrote about the people who had helped her along the way, colleagues who had defended her even when it was socially uncomfortable, the therapist who had helped her see that leaving wasn't failure, and Mitchell, whose words in that cafe had been the catalyst for her reintegration. Sarah realized as she wrote that her story wasn't just about pain, but also about the human capacity to heal, to find purpose again, to transform trauma into wisdom. 18 months after that transformative encounter in the cafe, Sarah's book was published by a publisher specializing in nonfiction about public service. It didn't become a national bestseller, but it found its audience, being adopted by several fire departments as required reading and generating discussions in departments across the country. Sarah received hundreds of messages from firefighters, paramedics, and other emergency professionals thanking her for putting into words what many felt but couldn't express. One of these messages came from one of the women at the cafe, the blonde who had spoken so casually about fake firefighters. She wrote a long email apologizing again, explaining that the encounter had been a wake-up call for her about how powerful her words were, how she had absorbed and perpetuated harmful stereotypes without critical reflection. She mentioned that she now volunteered with an organization that supported women in non-traditional careers, trying in some way to compensate for the damage her past attitudes had caused. Sarah responded to the email gracefully, thanking her for the message and the change of perspective. She didn't pretend the words hadn't hurt, but also acknowledged that growth was possible, that people could learn and evolve. That email exchange brought a sense of closure that Sarah didn't know she needed, a kind of circle completing itself from that difficult day at the cafe to this moment of mutual recognition and growth. Sarah also began working more closely with Mitchell on an ambitious project to create a national resource center for the mental health of first responders. The idea was to have a centralized place where firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and others could access resources, find specialized therapists, connect with support groups, and share experiences anonymously if they wished. It was a massive undertaking that would require years of work and substantial funding, but both were committed to the vision. On a warm summer afternoon, 3 years after their initial meeting at the cafe, Sarah was back in Seattle for the official launch of the resource center. The ceremony took place at the same fire station, where she had responded to that fateful call years before, a place filled with memories both painful and precious. Many of her former colleagues were present, some she hadn't seen since leaving the department. The reunions were emotional, full of hugs and tears, but also laughter and shared memories of the good times. Sarah realized she had been so focused on the pain of her departure that she had forgotten the moments of genuine camaraderie, the inside jokes, the shared victories after successful calls. It wasn't all bad, she acknowledged, and holding on to only the painful parts had been her own form of self-preservation, but one that had also deprived her of memories she could now cherish again. During the ceremony, Mitchell gave a moving speech about the importance of caring for those who care for others, about recognizing that strength does not mean invulnerability, about creating systems that support rather than break. He then invited Sarah to the stage, introducing her not as a former firefighter, but as a leader in systemic change, someone whose courage to be vulnerable had opened doors for countless others. Sarah spoke briefly, keeping her words simple and direct. She thanked everyone who had supported the project, acknowledged the long road ahead, and then ended with a reflection. She said that for a long time she had believed her story was about failing, about not being strong enough to endure what others endured. But now she understood that her story was about surviving, about having the courage to prioritize her mental health, about finding new ways to serve when the old path became unsustainable. When the ceremony ended, Sarah walked to the fire station, running her fingers along the walls where her name was still listed on a commemorative plaque from the Medal of Valor recipients. She thought of the 3 children she had saved, now teenagers living their lives, probably without much thought for the woman who had once carried them through the smoke and fire. And that was okay, Sarah realized. She hadn't done it for recognition or gratitude, but because that was who she was, because when faced with an impossible choice, she had chosen courage over safety. And now, in a different but equally important way, she was still making that choice every day, every time she shared her story, every time she supported someone struggling with their own doubts, every time she challenged a system that prioritized appearances over abilities. She was choosing courage. Sarah finally understood that heroism wasn't just about dramatic moments in burning buildings, but also about the quiet, persistent work of creating change, of refusing to let the pain of injustice turn her into someone bitter or defeated. She left the station that summer afternoon with a lighter heart than she had in years, knowing she had finally made peace with her past and was genuinely excited about her future. And as she drove back to Portland through the green mountains of the Pacific Northwest, Sarah Matthews, former firefighter, survivor, mentor, and change agent, smiled to herself, finally able to say with complete honesty that she regretted nothing, not even the hardest parts, because they had all led up to this moment of deep, purposeful peace.